So I'd like to introduce our speakers this morning. So our first speaker is Cathy Cook. She is a corporate partner at LCF Law. LCF Law is an award-winning full-service Yorkshire law firm advising both private and commercial clients across the region. Put simply, we understand law so our clients don't have to. We're great listeners and we understand our client's situation. Our second speaker is Alex Shields. Alex is an advisor and chartered financial planner from the private office. The private office are a firm of independent chartered financial planners with offices in Leeds, Bath and London. They're planning led, they work on fixed fees and collaboratively, both as teams within TPO, but also with professionals like you and I. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Cathy for our first session. Thank you, Cathy.
Thank you very much. I will just share my screen. So Alex and I are talking to you this morning about how to extract cash from limited companies. And just to make absolutely sure that you're all awake, we're going to start off with a poll. Oh, sorry, I've gone forward a page. Right, so the question is, should a director shareholder be an employee? And I'll give you a little bit of time to submit your answers. That's really good. Right, I'll bring this to an end. And most of you have said, I'm going to share the results. And most of you said that it depends. The 27% said yes. And actually, whoever said it depends, absolutely right. You would almost always recommend that somebody should be a director, an employee of a company. The only circumstances in which you wouldn't expect them to be is if they're having contributions paid via other work or are so independently wealthy that they don't need state support. In almost all circumstances, you want to make sure that you're paying national insurance contributions so that should the need arise, you'll qualify for SSP, statutory maternity pay, state pension, and you can also qualify for up to £30,000 lump sum compensatory award, settlement agreement should the need arise. So in the event that things did go badly wrong with your other shareholding directors. So starting up a business, the first question, and some of you here may already have been in this position, is how is it funded? And we find that usually it's a loan, and that's either commercial or private, whether it's come from family resources or from a bank or building society or some other commercial organisation. The difficulty is that if you're taking on commercial loan, you've got to ensure that your business is actually going to be able to pay any statutory payments. So it's not particularly flexible and does give an element of risk with it, particularly in the early days. And the other way that you put money into a company is via way of share capital. That is difficult because there are only specific limited circumstances in which those funds can be extracted from the company. And so if you are going to want to be able to get that money out, then we wouldn't normally recommend that you inject funds by way of share subscription if you can help it. And then when you come to extracting cash, the ways to do it, you can look at the repayment of expenses. And the difficulty with the repayment of expenses is, and people forget to do this, is that they do need to ensure that they've got a P11D in relation to any expenses that they've paid on behalf of the company. Otherwise, it's considered to be a director's loan from the company to the individual. And in the event that the company becomes insolvent, one of the most common creditors' claims is against directors for repayment of expenses. And that's usually just because a P11D hasn't been issued. There's also salary. As we've said previously, it's a really good idea to pay a salary to make sure you get those national insurance contributions paid. The difficulty is in the early days, Can the company afford to pay a salary, because it is a set payment on a monthly basis or a weekly basis, whatever it may be, but then can the individual afford for you not to pay the salary? There's repayment of the director's loans, and this is really flexible. It's got no tax consequences unless there's interest payable, and can be extracted as and when the company is in a position to do so. Dividends are great, but you've got to be making profit, and if you're not, they're unlawful. A lot of companies don't realise this, and a lot of people start off saying, oh, we'll just pay ourselves dividends from day one, not realising that they're not actually making any money. And that can have profound implications. There are exemptions to it, but there's a potential benefit in kind tax charge on the individual receiving the unlawful loan. And in addition, there's also a potential corporation tax charge on the company of 32.5%, again, unless it falls within specific exceptions. And then there are also payments in kind where the company can pay for benefits on behalf of the individual shareholder director. I'm not going to talk about this in much detail. I'm going to leave that to Alex, who's going to just cover it in his session. Now, the way to get around the importance of shareholders agreements, and this isn't just a shareholders agreement, which you may well have heard of. This is just documents between the shareholders and the company generally to cover differing circumstances of the shareholders. And a prime example is where you've got two shareholders in a company. One is an empty nester, the other one has a young family. One wants contributions to his pension fund, the other one wants dividend and salary because he's got a large mortgage and school fees to pay. So how do you do it? Well, you can have different classes of shares which have different dividend payments on them. So you can differentiate between the two different classes of shares. And that would be dealt with via your Articles of Association, which is a public document. You can also have a shareholders agreement where you can talk about all of the unexpected things that may very well arise. And if you can do that in advance, when you've all got clear heads and you're thinking rationally, it often works out much, much better in the long term. So covering off situations like illness, what happens, how long can a fit shareholder continue to support an individual if his business partner isn't contributing? And resentment can build up despite everyone's best intentions, and working shareholders can feel very badly done to, while also knowing that the other chap isn't exactly, or the other lady isn't exactly wanting to be in this situation. So if you've sat down in advance and written down, you know, how long you're going to be able to continue to support, at what point you might require one of them to transfer their shares, it can really help. And it can also help to put in place a business power of attorney, so that should one shareholder be unable to run the business, he can appoint someone to act on his behalf and to look after his interests. Of course, it's unexpected, but it's going to happen to all of us, death, and it often happens in businesses. And the worst situation for a company is that a surviving shareholder is suddenly in business with the family of his deceased business partner. The way to get around this is to ensure that you put in place life protection. These protection policies can be put into trust for the benefit of the other, and then you have a cross-option agreement, which means that should one shareholder die, the other shareholders in the company who are working in the business suddenly get a pot of cash from the proceeds of the life policy, which enables them to buy the shares from the family of the deceased shareholder. The family have money to be able to get on with their lives, and the continuing shareholders have all the shares in the company. Retirement can also cause all sorts of problems, and that can be precipitated by, you know, a period of ill health. The one thing that we find that doesn't work is that one guy retires but thinks that he can keep his shares. And again, the resentment builds up. Why should I be working all of these hours and you expect to get 50% of the profit? So it's a really good idea to have specific provisions either in the shareholders agreement or in the articles, which say that should you cease to be an operational employee shareholder in the company, then you will transfer your shares, and to set out a mechanism by which those shares will be valued and paid for. In the event of dispute, particularly if it's a 50-50 shareholding, it's worse than divorce. You can't walk away for unreasonable behaviour. So if you've got something written into an agreement stating what happens in the event of dispute, it does benefit everybody. And finally, there's also divorce, and this may happen to only one of the business partners. The business partners themselves may be married, but again, it can cause all sorts of difficulties and does tend to take the divorcing shareholder's eye off the ball at quite a crucial time. It can impact adversely on the business. And also can be really damaging if the business assets are pulled into the divorce proceedings. So it may be worth either putting deemed transfer provisions into your articles or your shareholders agreement, so that if one of the director shareholders has passed shares to a spouse, then those shares are given back to that spouse in the event of divorce proceedings, or indeed to have a pre or post-nup agreement if you're contemplating or are newly married, to make sure that the business assets aren't caught up in any potential divorce proceedings. And a salutary tale, I was involved a long time ago in a situation where two brothers had been in business. It was the father's business initially, 50-50 shareholders. They'd done some planning. They put in place a life policy to pay out a sum of money, but they hadn't then put in place the cross-option agreements to require the family to transfer the shares in the event that one of them died. So unfortunately, one of the brothers did die. His son was working in the business at the time, but was very young. Everybody was very shocked he was too young to die. It came as a huge blow to them all. And his brother, the surviving brother, turned to the widow and said, look, I've got this pot of cash because we put in place these life policies. Rather than me buy his shares, how about we split the pot of cash and you keep the shares that you can then pass on down to your son? So she thought this was very fair, and they decided that they would have a shareholders agreement. But before they could negotiate the shareholders agreement, the wife decided that as a 50% shareholder in the business, she should be entitled to walk into the business premises, check the tax records, check the personnel records, help herself to the company diesel, generally cause all kinds of trouble. And the brother was saying to her, but you're not a director, you're not entitled to this. It didn't go down very well, and ultimately it ended up with the widow not talking to her son or her brother-in-law. The son now has his father's 50% of the shares in the company, and it's caused a real family rift. So the final way of getting the money out of your company is exiting. And actually, there are so many questions that arise as a result of this. And it's very much, when are you planning on selling? Who is selling, and why does it matter? And this comes down to the potential buyers. If they're buying from a trust, then it's going to be difficult to find. It might affect the price because you can't give warranty cover in the event of a claim. And who might potentially the buyers be? And again, this can also really help the structure of the deal. And if you can identify in advance who your buyers might be, you can ensure that you put the correct sort of structures in place in advance. So if it's existing shareholders, the likelihood is that you're not going to have to give quite the same level of warranties or any warranties or tax covenant, and it's likely to be much quicker. But do the existing shareholders want to buy you out? If it's trade, then that could potentially be commercially sensitive, and you're going to have to be really careful about how you handle the provision of information. Private equity, again, it's how they're going to structure it, and very often private equity are going to want the assets of the company they're buying to help in raising the purchase price. A management buyout, usually bank funding involved. There's going to have to be quite significant due diligence, and you just need to start planning in advance to make sure that everything is in order, to make sure that this is all going to work. And an employee ownership trust, which they're becoming more and more popular, although they still have only been about 300 in the country. They're great for a seller because they don't pay any capital gains tax. But in terms of a structuring point of view, particularly where it's a very small company, if the directors have employed spouses or family in the business, then they may suddenly find that they don't meet the qualifying criteria for an employee ownership trust. And in that planning to exit, you also need to think about what might an exit look like. and whether you can get all of your cash on completion, which would be great, but who can actually do that, who has those reserves at the moment, adjusted cash based on the performance of the company, the completion accounts, and some form of earnout. And earnout is particularly used in private equity style transactions, where they're going to want you to stay in the company and basically prove its worth. And you may want to put provisions in the agreement to ensure that the company continues to be run in the same way as you did previously, so that it can actually meet those earnout targets. Deferred consideration is very, very likely in sales to management buyout teams, or even sales to existing shareholders. And again, you may want to be thinking about whether or not you have guarantees, how you ensure that you will indeed get your money out at the end of the day. So hopefully that's given you a really broad overview of the way that money can be extracted. And I'm now going to hand over to Alex. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Cathy. I'm just going to share screen. Great. Well, thanks very much, Cathy, and good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to talk through some post-budget financial planning opportunities for business owners. So first of all, the regulatory bit. This session is not designed as specific or individual advice. It should not be taken as such. Please note that investments go down as well as up, and you may not get back the amount you originally invest. So now let's run through the agenda for today's session. I will start off with a summary of the budget, what has changed and what hasn't. This will lead into a pensions refresher. What is the lifetime allowance, and what can you do if you have exceeded it? What is the annual allowance, and how could taking salary or dividends out of your business affect this? And why are pension contributions a tax-efficient way of taking profits out of your business? I will then talk through the new super deduction. How does this work, and how can you utilise your pensions to make further use of it? And then I'll discuss the planning for 2026. Rishi Sunak's tax changes have been described as stealth tax rises, as tax rates are not increasing now, but we will feel the full effects of these in 5 years' time. So I'll be looking at what you need to do now to plan for 2026. Then I'll look at some options when investing in the business, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So firstly, for those of you who are not familiar with the private office, I thought it would be helpful to start with an introduction to us as a firm. So we are a firm of independent chartered financial planners, and we are a chartered business, so all our advisors are either chartered or studying towards it. We're truly independent, meaning we're able to put all options across the whole market on the table for our clients. Importantly, we're a planning-led firm, and we often use cash flow modelling software to build financial plans for clients. And if appropriate as part of the agreed plan, we can also include an investment and management service through our dedicated team. We also have direct access to the best cash rates available in the market through our sister company, Savings Champion, and this is key as cash forms the foundation of any proper plan. Finally, we charge a fixed initial advice fees based on our experience of time and complexity of the work involved. As you'd expect, these are fully transparent and fixed at outset, so our clients are clear on all costs prior to proceeding with us. So moving on to the budget. During the budget on the 3rd of March, Rishi Sunak announced the first wave of steps to pay back the growing debt mountain that has been created by the government's response to COVID, with most allowances and tax bands frozen for the next 5 years, and corporation tax sets to increase up to 25% in 2023. From a financial planning perspective, the freezing of these tax allowances will be felt by many over the next 5 years, and I'll be looking at some examples of this as we go through today's presentation. And to start off, I've got an audience poll. So of all the changes announced in Rishi Sunak's budget on 3rd of March, which tax change is expected to raise the most in additional tax revenue? So you should see that on your screen now. The options are capital gains tax, the lifetime allowance, inheritance tax, income tax, or corporation tax. So we'll give a few more seconds to get the answers in. Great, so now we'll share the results, and as you can see, most people have got the answer right. It is that corporation tax increase. A few people have said income tax, which was the next highest, and then capital gains tax, lifetime allowance, and inheritance tax, actually relatively small increases in tax revenue, as I'll show in a minute. But yeah, so that's interesting to see. Most people did get that correct. And if we go on to the next slide, we can see the figures involved here. So on the left-hand side, you can see capital gains tax, lifetime allowance, and inheritance tax, all under £1 billion. But yeah, the main tax take is the income tax and corporation tax. I'm not showing that on the right-hand side. So, and I think that's key for business owners, really, the income tax and corporation tax for increases, because clearly that's you can expect to either pay income tax or corporation and dividend tax on profits. So we'll be looking today at what you can do to potentially mitigate that. So first of all, let's look at these tax changes in more detail. So what's happened to income tax to start off with? Well, the personal allowance has increased by £70, and the higher rate tax threshold has increased by £270 to £50,270. All other tax rates and bands have stayed the same, but crucially, the removal of the annual inflationary increases has meant that these taxes will increase in real terms over the next 5 years until April 2026. So moving on to corporation tax. This is the bulk of the additional tax take, estimated at 47 billion over the next 5 years. Corporation tax on limited company profits will remain at 19% up until April 2023, but from April 2023, this will increase to 25% for companies with profits over £250,000. For companies with profits of less than £50,000, corporation tax will remain at 19%, with a taper for companies with profits between £50,000 and £250,000. So given income tax is set to increase in real terms and corporation tax is set to increase in nominal terms, what can you do about this? One option is to make a pension contribution. Now, these are very tax efficient, as they can be offset against corporation tax. So when that increases in future, the tax saving associated with a pension contribution will also increase. So this slide shows if a company is making £350,000 in profits, makes a £100,000 pension contribution, the corporation tax saving will increase from £19,000 now to £25,000 from 2024 onwards. The downside, of course, is that you cannot access funds within the pension until age 55, which increases to age 57 in 2028. And given how tax efficient pension contributions are, there are significant restrictions in terms of the amount you can contribute into pensions and also the total benefits you can build up. So let's have a look at these restrictions, which did not change in the budget. You still receive corporation tax on business pension contributions or tax relief at your marginal income tax rate on personal contributions. But please note, employer contributions must be wholly and exclusively for business purposes. The contributions are still restricted by the annual allowance, which remains at £40,000, and an individual if an individual has taken flexible benefits from their pension, then the money purchase annual allowance of £4,000 per annum applies with no carry forward available. Finally, I'd point out that the 25% pension commencement lump sum is to remain, and that's up to the lifetime allowance, with the remaining benefits tax at the marginal income tax rate in retirement, which could of course be lower than the current tax rate paid. So how does the annual allowance work in practice? Well, as I mentioned, it's £40,000, but it reduces down to £4,000 per annum for high earners. If contributions in excess of the annual allowance are made, an annual allowance tax charge is incurred, which effectively removes the tax relief on the contribution. So to understand if you're affected by the tapered annual allowance, you need to look at two areas. Firstly, on the left-hand side, the threshold income, which broadly speaking is your taxable income less for your personal pension contributions. If this is over £200,000, then you also need to look at your adjusted income, which broadly speaking is your taxable income plus employer pension contributions. Now, if this exceeds £240,000, that's your adjusted income. So if that's above £240,000, your annual allowance is reduced on a 2-to-1 basis down to £4,000 at £312,000. You can see this on this graph here, starting at 40 and then going down to the £4,000. But I should add to this that if you exceed the annual allowance, there is carry forward available. So you're able to carry forward unused allowances from the previous 3 years as long as you were a member of a registered UK pension scheme at some point in the tax year in question. However, the adjusted income and threshold income figures I've just referred to were lower in previous years, and I would suggest speaking to a financial advisor if in any doubt about the amount you can pay into your pension. As a business owner, you can carefully control the taxable income and your company pension contributions, and there are therefore often planning opportunities that will allow you to maximise pension contribution, bearing in mind the tapered annual allowance. So again, this is an area where it's good to get advice. So moving on to the lifetime allowance, that's currently £1,073,100, and it's been confirmed that this will be frozen until 2026. So any benefits above the lifetime allowance incur a lifetime allowance tax charge of either 25% plus income tax or 55%. And the key thing here is the freezing of the lifetime allowance until 2026 means that you may exceed the lifetime allowance when previously you may not have done if those inflationary increases had taken place. So let's look at this in practice, how the potential implications of it. If we look at this example, this individual's got a defined contribution pension of £950,000, and he's projected to have a pension pot of £1,155,000 by 2026 if growth of 4% per annum is achieved. Now, this could lead to a lifetime allowance tax charge of up to £45,000, when previously there may not have been any tax charge, depending on the level of inflationary increases to the lifetime allowance. So what can you do about this? Well, upon reaching the lifetime allowance, if age 55 or over, you could consider taking the pension commencement lump sum from the pension. This crystallises the pension and tests the pension against the lifetime allowance at the time benefits are taken. If this can be done prior to the total value of the pension exceeding the lifetime allowance, there should be no lifetime allowance tax charge to pay, as long as any growth from the remaining fund that enters drawdown is drawn prior to the individual reaching age 75. However, the disadvantage of this approach is that the tax-free cash becomes part of the individual's estate for inheritance tax purposes, and if that cash is then invested, gains from this will be subject to tax. So there's pros and cons of each approach, and financial advice should be taken before taking any action. Additionally, there are two types of pension protection that can still be applied for. Firstly, Fixed Protection 2016. This entitles the individual to a lifetime allowance of 1.25 million, but only if they've not made any pension contributions since 5th of April 2016. So it's quite rare that you would come across somebody in that situation, but there's also Individual Protection 2016. So this entitles the individual to a lifetime allowance of the value of their pensions as at the 5th of April 2016, up to a maximum of 1.25 million, even if they have contributed into the pension since this date. So this you tend to see more often with people who are still contributing, but maybe didn't realise they were over the lifetime allowance. One final option, which one of my clients did recently, was he managed to save £200,000 in lifetime allowance tax charges as part of a pension share to his ex-spouse when he got divorced. But I wouldn't say that's exactly standard tax planning, but it was an advantage of what happened there. Now moving on to the super deduction. So since 1st of April this year and available until March 2026, companies investing in qualifying new plant and machinery assets are able to claim. There's two options. So firstly, 130% super deduction capital allowance on qualifying plant and machinery. Now these investments are not limited to the 1 million annual investment allowance, and the 130% super deduction effectively increases the standard 19% corporation tax saving by 30% up to 24.7% as the total saving. There's also a 50% first year allowance for qualifying special rate assets, which would ordinarily receive 6% relief. So what qualifies? There's no exhaustive list, but this I've outlined on this slide some potential examples. So we're talking kind of computer equipment, refrigeration units, office chairs, that sort of thing. But as I say, there's no exhaustive list. So what can you do to take full advantage of this tax break, even if you don't have enough cash in the business to make the investments that you want to? So I thought I'd highlight a couple of potential options here. First of all, a small self-administered scheme, a SAS, is a type of pension that can loan 50% of its value to a sponsoring employer. So this could be a way to raise cash within the business to fund an investment into plant and machinery. Interest payments in respect to the loan do not count towards the annual allowance, so that can be helpful if you've fully utilised this. And there's a wide range of investment options for the remainder of the pension, including commercial property, which say the business premises is already owned by the business and it's purchased by the pension, then that could free some cash up in the business. But I would stress that both these areas can be quite complex, and advice should be taken before taking any action. Just referring back to the loan that I mentioned from the SAS, the Small Self-Administered Scheme, there's some key rules in terms of setting that up. So it can only total 50% of the net scheme assets. The loan must be secured by having first charge over an asset, such as a commercial property. The maximum term for the loan is 5 years, and the repayments must be both capital and interest. And finally, the interest rate must be commercial. So I thought I'd just highlight regarding the commercial property purchase, with the potential commercial property purchase within the pension, the advantages and disadvantages. So I think the key advantages are tax-free growth, and that the rent payments potentially paid into the pension would not count towards the annual allowance. So again, an advantage if funding is an issue. But I would say that this could be seen as putting all eggs in one basket, where you're reliant on your business for both income and also your pension. So I think that's a key disadvantage. Now moving on to investing within a business. So I often get inquiries from business owners who have cash in their business and they want it to work harder for them because it's earning very little interest. So when considering the best options for the cash, the time frame is crucial. So as we've just seen, pension contributions are a very tax efficient way to take money out of the business. But often the time frame for when the funds are needed may be a lot shorter. So in this case, the best option is often just to leave the money in cash. And that's where I would refer to our sister company, Savings Champion, who have best buy tables for company accounts. And I've put the link on the slide there. But that said, if funds need to stay in the business for the medium to long term, but a company pension contribution wouldn't be appropriate, then you could look to invest in stocks and shares. And in these circumstances, you could consider an offshore investment bond, which offers simplicity for accounting. So in this case, gains are either taxable on an annual basis or upon surrender, depending on the size of the company. But a key disadvantage is, of course, that corporation tax is increasing in future. So tax on the growth is going to increase in future. So just to finish off with some action points for planning for 2026, what do you need to do? Well, first of all, I would say review your pensions. Do you need to increase or reduce contributions, bearing in mind the lifetime allowance position, and to think not only about the value of your pension relative to the lifetime allowance now, but what that will be in 2026. Also, I'd say making use of the various allowances available is key. These won't be increasing in the next 5 years, so really need to make use of them now. Also, there's the super deduction available if investment's going to be appropriate in the short term, and also the timing of pension contributions, bearing in mind corporation tax is increasing in future. You've also got the annual allowance to think about. When is going to be the best time to make those contributions? And finally, with making the most of the pension. So would a loan from the pension to the business be appropriate? Would purchasing a commercial property in the pension be appropriate? These are all, they do have advantages and disadvantages, but something to consider. And if you'd like to discuss any of these potential options further, feel free to contact me and we can arrange a time for a discussion after today's presentation. Great, so I'm now going to pass back to Rachel for the questions.
Nearly jumped in too quick then. Thanks both Cathy and Alex for those. We do have a couple of questions. Alex, if you just want to share your camera again, that would be great. So I don't know who this might be appropriate for, but we've had a question from Mr. Abbott in relation to company expenses. The question is, regarding expenses, would you expect your accountant to automatically prepare a P11D as part of the accounts, or do you need to make a specific instruction to them? There's a thought that it might be automatic, but the fact that it's been mentioned, I think it might have been from Cathy actually, that he just needed to check whether or not that was an automatic instruction or whether he needed to actually instruct the accountant.
I suspect it would depend very much on your accountant, but I think it's probably something that you would need to mention to them.
Okay, that's simply done. And a question, I think this might be one for Alex. So, and actually quite useful from my point of view in advising family law clients, actually. A client says, I've previously taken tax-free cash, but no income from the SIP. Can I continue to fund my pension from the company?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mentioned the money purchase annual allowance, which can be incurred when flexible benefits are taken. But the key thing is whether you've actually taken the income. So if just tax-free cash has been taken, then the money purchase annual allowance doesn't apply. But if you had taken any income at all, even if it's £1, then the money purchase annual allowance would apply. I think just one thing to be careful is there are rules around lump sum recycling. So you can't be seen to be taking the tax-free cash and then funding the pension. But crucially, the money purchase annual allowance wouldn't apply in that scenario you've just mentioned.
Excellent. Okay, and I think we've got one again, you, not from a personal point, from personal advice that I give to clients is relevant. So if a client wants to extract an asset from a business rather than cash, is that possible, and how could that be done?
It can be done by dividend if there are available reserves. Otherwise, it would have to be at value, and they'd have to pay for it and make sure that it was certified to be as value. Otherwise, and go through the company's house procedures. Otherwise, the transaction could well be put aside, and the asset could be recovered in the event of insolvency.
Right. Okay. I'm handy to know as well. And let's have a look. Okay, so we've got a question from the chat. Again, not quite sure who it's directed to, but either of you can jump in, obviously. What are the risks of earn out? If you no longer have control, what if the new owners treat income and profit in a way that would disadvantage you? What would be the remedy?
It would be down to the way that the sale agreement were drafted and the controls that were put over what they could and couldn't do. And often you can say that if they intended to treat it in a specific way, you could say, you'll treat it in exactly the same way. However, if you treat it differently, for the purposes of calculating the earn out, we will add back in that difference. And it's just to make sure that that document is covered. So we'd have to work quite closely with the current accountants when preparing it.
That's great, thank you. And just one more then. I think, Alex, this might be for you, just to make sure everything is covered. So the question is, I am 55 and I have both a personal pension and a defined benefit pension due to come in to payment at 65, at which point this person thinks that they're going to exceed the lifetime allowance. Is there anything he can do now to prevent a lifetime allowance tax charge in the future?
Yeah, that's I think a good question, given the lifetime allowance is going to be frozen. So again, kind of links back to what I was saying about planning now. So there's a few, it will depend on individual objectives, but there's a few things to think about here. First of all, can any protection be applied for? So the fixed protection I mentioned, or individual protection. Would taking the benefits from that defined benefit scheme early be appropriate? So that it's often possible to take those benefits early, but there would be an early payment penalty. That obviously means you get a lower pension, but then you're using up less of your lifetime allowance by doing that. So that's something to consider. Also, the potential to take some tax-free cash from the pension with no income. So again, as I mentioned earlier, you crystallize, you take benefits at that, and you're tested against the lifetime allowance at that time. So potentially, if the pension is going to grow in future, you're kind of crystallizing the pension earlier before that growth has taken place, and that can be more tax efficient. So really, there's quite a few options there, and the way I'd approach something like that is to use cash flow modeling software. Have a look at the current situation in terms of any taxable income you have at the moment, and whether, for example, taking that pension early would be appropriate, the defined benefit pension early would be appropriate, and then really look at the different options really to with the pros and cons of each approach to kind of build your plan for retirement. And I think cash flow modeling software is a good way of doing that.
Excellent. Well, that's been very helpful. Let me just check the chat just to see if there's any other questions come through. If anybody else has any questions, by all means jump in. No? Okay, well, I appreciate everybody's time is very valuable. So I'd just like to say thanks ever so much to Cathy and to Alex. It was very insightful thoughts and commentary, and obviously the answers to the questions was great. Thank you to you, our attendees, for joining us. Really appreciate giving up your valuable time for us this morning. Hope you found it interesting. Again, as I say, all the feedback is really useful. So we'll be sending those out after this morning. Again, we'll send a link. So if anybody does want to watch it again or send it on, or indeed has any other questions, then please do get in touch. So thank you very much for your time, everybody. Have a great day, and I will end the meeting now. Thank you.